almost like these amoebas that we're trying to adapt together and figure out not only what's coming, but how can we best adapt and thrive and stay alive. Because that's the other thing, too, about the living system model. It's all about what is giving life to the system. Living things want to survive, and so they'll find ways to do that.
Welcome to another episode of the Management Theory Toolbox, your top destination to understand the behind-the-scenes theory of the management and business world. If you're an entrepreneur, manager, or even just someone interested in the business world, and you're always curious about the why behind certain management concepts, not just the what, then you're in the right place. I'm your host, Travis Mallett, and today we'll be venturing into the fascinating world of organizations and emergence. Let's start with a basic but crucial question. What is an organization? From your local corner bakery to multinational tech giants like Microsoft and Intel, organizations are a fundamental part of modern society. So much so that several commentators from Harvard University expressed it this way. Modern societies are not market economies. They are organizational economies in which companies are the chief actors in creating value and advancing economic progress. So here's a textbook definition of an organization. An organization is a network of individuals forming a coordinated system of specialized activities. They aim to achieve specific goals over an extended period with continuity over time, regardless of changes in individual membership. Now, this definition might seem straightforward, and you probably could have taken a good stab at guessing something relatively close to it if I had asked you out of the blue. But at the Management Theory Toolbox, we always want to look behind the scenes. Forget the boring textbook definition. Let's develop a deeper view of organizations, one which adds a bit of intrigue and mystery to the concept, in a way that just might become a tool in your management toolbox. You might recall from the introductory episode that studying management is like gazing at the stars. An infinite number of data points and concepts are in our view. Today, we're going to take that, perhaps, a bit too literally. Does this sound like it calls for a philosophical tangent? I wouldn't expect anything less. So pack a lunch. We might end up in some unexpected places. The story of our universe, often termed cosmic evolution or Darwinian cosmology, began around 13.8 billion years ago. This narrative takes us from a homogeneous point of pure energy to an explosion, or rather, an expansion. The four fundamental forces separated, electrons and nuclei formed atoms. Hold on, we're getting a call.
Yeah, I had a question. Are you sure this has something to do with management? I wasn't expecting a science class.
That's a good question. Hang on, we're getting there. And we're going to end up with a whole new way of understanding organizations, one that just might have a real impact on your business ventures. So where were we? Oh yeah, the Big Bang formed atoms, and those atoms clustered forming stars and planets. Stars, through nuclear fusion, expanded the periodic table from the original 3 elements to almost 100 naturally occurring chemical elements. They spread these elements throughout the universe through supernovae explosions. The dust of the Earth brought forth single-celled life, which eventually evolved into more complex organisms and societies. The underlying unifiers in this tale are evolution and complexity, interweaving physical, biological, and cultural changes in a broad, inclusive, cosmic evolutionary scenario. Together, they produce a phenomenon known as emergence. Emergence, in its most basic form, is a process where the whole becomes more than just the sum of its parts. It's the complexity that arises from a collection of interacting simpler elements. Atoms combine to produce molecules, which exhibit characteristics and behavior significantly different from their underlying constituents. Molecules combine together to produce cells, which again display emergent behavior quite unlike their individual parts. Single cells combine together to produce multicellular organisms, and so on. The story culminates in the most complex object currently known to exist in the universe, the human brain, where cells and neurons combine to produce a cumulative, emergent behavior that is absolutely, wildly different from any of the underlying elements. So what exactly does this have to do with business and organizations? From a philosophical sense, organizations are one of the latest developments in the universe's continual unfolding of emergent behavior. Ever since humans began forming groups to accomplish unified goals, they've put on an impressive display of the latest unfolding of emergence. And when we participate in the business world, we are participating in the greatest show on earth, to repurpose the phrase from Dawkins. A show that has produced wonders of unimaginable complexity: computers, the internet, asphalt, space travel, and Snapchat. This is the essence of emergent behavior. Okay, let's come back to Earth after that philosophical tangent. You might be wondering if there are any practical applications for this idea. In fact, I think this idea, that organizations are a spectacular example of emergence, perhaps even the pinnacle of emergence in nature. This idea of emergence leads us to a management theory with profound implications for our day-to-day activities in the business world. It's a view of organizations as living systems rather than as machines. To help us explore this idea, we're joined by Kati Livingston. Hi, Kati, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, Travis, thanks for having me on.
Before we get started, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your background and work.
I'm Kati Livingston. I am an instructor in the graduate management program at the Harvard Extension School. I've been doing that for about 12 years now. I also have a consulting practice. It's called CMS Associates. That stands for Coaching Mindful Systems. We're all about systems and the human messiness of systems. My background is in adult development and psychology, and so that's what brings me to this work.
Thanks, Kati. And just to say, we're thrilled to have you on the show. So today, we're just exploring the concept of emergence in nature and discussing how organizations fit into that story that's been unfolding. And a question that comes up is, are organizations more than just a fixed web of individuals? Maybe we should be thinking about them as living systems. Mm-hmm. But before we get into that, I think we should first talk about an all too common counter view, the model of organizations as machines. Could you tell us a bit about that idea, the idea of organizations as machines, and maybe tell us where that idea comes from?
Yeah, sure. So this idea of organizations as machines has been around for a while. It really got codified in the early 1900s. And the basic idea is that organizations exist to produce something. And the activity of producing that something can be broken into parts and roles, and processes can be created that make production happen as efficiently and seamlessly as possible. The term really comes from Frederick Taylor. He was an American engineer who published the Principles of Scientific Management back in 1912. And that was really the beginning of companies using these series of rules that are very disciplined and routinized to organize human behavior.
Thanks, Kati. Now, I come from an engineering background, and engineering is all about abstraction, modeling, and control. And the process is to abstract from the complex details of a system, circuit, or product, and dial into the kernel of functionality and model it. And once you can model a system, then you can control it. Now, when you apply that mindset to organizations, imagining them as machines and setting aside the intricate human dynamics, it seems like it gives clarity on how information and materials flow through the various processes. So it's not surprising to hear that this approach played a pivotal role during the Industrial Revolution and in tackling certain business challenges. Could you shed some light on which problems this model fits best?
The engineering context that you just introduced is quite relevant here. This metaphor is useful when there's one best way of doing something, or you can figure out what's the best option of many. You know what your starting point is. You know what endpoint you're after. And then from that, you can build a system that's linear and predictable. For example, I work a lot in financial services, and there are some processes that need to be predictable and linear. There are clear rules to follow. There needs to be a process. There have to be timelines. Building a system that's linear and predictable allows everybody on the team to know what the steps are. They know what their roles are, and they know what the end result looks like. In a highly compliant environment like financial services, you do not want mistakes. I would assume the same thing in a lot of engineering processes where people going off the rails is going to introduce potential harm, not only to the workers themselves, but also to the end user. This idea of the machine model is when you've got highly predictable results that you want to get after, and you're trying to produce something, again, that's predictable.
So it seems that viewing organizations as machines aligns closely with the notion of predictable linear systems. But when we think about organizations and the concept of emergence, we realize pretty quickly that organizations might be much more intricate than that. Mm-hmm. Maybe resisting the neat boxes and boundaries that the machine model might try to impose. So where does this organization as machines approach start to break down?
Yeah, and this will lead into the other model we're going to talk about, living systems. The machine model really encourages predictability, and in organizations where human activity is involved, that same predictability can often promote boredom. I come in, I do the same thing every day, I know what's going to happen. And from that, the brain starts to build patterns and habits, which the brain loves because it helps us be efficient. And those same patterns and habits can often lead us to stop paying attention when things change, which change is always happening in organizations. Or you may find that this process or model we built needs some updating and innovating. It's this double-edged sword where the benefits of the machine model actually can hinder us because we can either get bored or we stop paying attention to things. There's a couple other common criticisms of the model, and those include that it places authority in the hands of a manager or a leader, and that the workers just follow instructions. The human workers become just parts of the machine. And then when the processes or humans don't work according to plan, they can often get framed as problems. And often humans get lumped into that category of problem. That's when this starts to not work in our favor.
So let's shift gears to the alternative perspective, the idea of organizations as living human systems. Can you tell us what it entails to view organizations through this lens, and perhaps some of the ramifications of adopting such a mindset?
Yeah. So it's a different way of looking at what organizations are. Organizations in this sense are not an entity in and of themselves, but they're the creation of the people within them. The other principle of the living system model is that humans are bringing their own past experiences and expectations to organizational activity. So there might be a dictated one right way, but in the minds and hearts of the people coming to work, there are many different ways of doing something. There's a book that we actually use in our class, The Appreciative Inquiry for Change Management, and the authors, I think, put it really nicely in just calling this kind of organization as a human phenomenon. It really puts human interaction and interactivity at the heart and soul of what organizations are. Some of the underlying assumptions of the living system model are that humans are not always rational. Organizing human activity is going to be chaotic at times. It's going to be naturally messy. And that's not actually a bad thing. It's not a problem to solve. But rather, it's a series of conversations to work through to have people make sense of what they need to be doing, what are the ways we want to be working together, and what are the next steps we need to take. One of the things about thinking of organizations in this way is it takes the pressure off of trying to fix and stabilize things, and it allows people to share what they're seeing, contribute their ideas, reinforce the patterns of interaction that are giving life to the system and producing results that the organization wants to see.
Something that I'm hearing from your description is that this model recognizes and embraces a whole bunch of messy internal interactions within an organization, which makes sense when we think of something as being alive. But I think the living system idea also has another important implication. when we think of living organisms, we also understand that they're located within and are responsive to their environment.
Right.
Can you tell us a bit more about the external influences in the context of the living system?
Yeah. So this model also assumes that the external environment is part of the system, whether it be changes in the industry, maybe there's new innovations by competitors, changes in the marketplace. Humans need to be able to respond and adapt their activity through what they're picking up. The pandemic is a great example. So there's a team and they all have these different roles and ways in which they're working. They know what they need to do. They need to talk to each other. They need to share information. And they've got some sort of routinized way of going about their day and getting things done. The pandemic was an external environment force that came in and really disrupted that system that they had in place. And what I observed is that teams who struggled the most wanted to get back to those processes that they knew. They wanted to lock down on, okay, here's what we need to do. Here's how we need to do it. Let's get back to work. Let's not be inefficient. And the teams that thrived took on that more living system model, which was, whoa, there's this thing that just came out of the blue. We do need to figure out how to get back online and work together, but maybe our parts need to interact in different ways that we hadn't been doing before. An emergence almost of a new system rather than trying to stay so rigid in its old roles like a machine.
So the pandemic is a really interesting example because it touches on so many different aspects of an organization: employee health, psychology, and of course, the economics of the business environment.
Yeah.
And that makes me think that the living systems idea might also be integral to corporate strategy as well, since strategy is fundamentally about finding that strategic fit between an organization and its environment. But this seems like it adds a whole new dimension to strategy, since the living system idea implies that organizations are not just these static objects that you can pick up and move through the business environment per a strategic analysis.
Yeah,
idea
very much
because
so.
they're also being acted upon by the business environment as well.
Yeah. And it's recognizing too that once you've figured out your strategy, it doesn't mean that that's going to be it. The external environment's going to continue to change. And there's got to be a dialogue between the organization and what's happening in the external environment. And the dialogue also needs to be happening within. So it really is like these amoebas that we're trying to adapt together and figure out not only what's coming, but how can we best adapt and thrive and stay alive. Because that's the other thing too about the living system model. It's all about what is giving life to the system. Living things want to survive. And so they'll find ways to do that.
So how does thinking about organizations this way change our behavior as managers or business owners?
Yeah. What I find interesting about understanding the contrast of these two models is that they raise our awareness about habit and the possibility of choice. The scientific management approach has a long legacy in business and management theory and management study. And so there can be a tendency for leaders to assume that business activity can be controlled, rationalized, and fixed. It's something that's just been in our vernacular for so long. And I found that leaders often use scientific management language out of habit when they actually might want something different of their teams and their organizations. So I'll give you a specific example. I once worked with a team where I was brought in because the team leader really had aspirations of her teams being collaborative and relying less on her as the leader and more on each other as resources. In our initial conversation, just understanding what would you like to see? And she said, I'd really like them to be a well-oiled machine. So in my mind, I thought, okay, there's that scientific management language when what she's describing to me isn't really fitting in that metaphor. But what was interesting is when I interviewed all the team members and I said, listen, your leaders expressed the desire to have you all act as a well-oiled machine. I asked them what that looked like. What would they be doing day to day? How would they be interacting with each other? And what I found were a couple of predominant themes. One is that people describe their role as being, well, I know what my role is on the team. I know what I'm supposed to do when I come in every day. I know what our deadlines are. I know what my part is on that. And it gets really frustrating when somebody on the team doesn't meet the deadline. And so they were already describing themselves as machine parts. I then asked a question about, okay, so when that happens, what's the next step? What tends to happen next? And they said, well, we go to the leader, we report to her that somebody didn't follow through or needs to be spoken with and that kind of thing. What was interesting, I found, is that the language that the leader was describing was really probably not even consciously, but directing team members' concept of what they were supposed to do and how they were supposed to be, and directed their behaviors. When we came together and had a big conversation about this, what they decided is really that's not what they want. That's definitely not what the team leader wanted. And so they scratched around and played with some different metaphors. And what they came up with instead is we need this team to act more like an ant colony. Now, none of us are scientists, so this may not even been 100% accurate. But the spirit of the idea is that, yes, they came in, they still had their roles, but when something happened, when somebody needed some help, they were willing to reallocate resources and time to go help that person. So the ant colony analogy is like, listen, you can build an ant colony, you can build a perfect system of tunnels and interconnections, but a storm comes and it wrecks it. Now you've got to start over and redeploy resources. So it just gave them a more fluid way of thinking about themselves and helped them understand the expectations a little bit differently and help shift their understanding about what the team leader wanted and also what the behavior would look like. So that's the choice I'm talking about. I think that this is an interesting model because it gives people different choices about what it is they're looking to create.
So just dismantling the organizations as machines model seems like a good start because it opens our eyes to a lot of the complexities that are happening around us. But, and I'm sure some of our listeners can relate, it feels like we've cracked open the door, peeked behind the curtain, and we might regret it. Forget the clear, well-established principles of scientific management as we get thrown into this messy, chaotic water with only a vague idea about how to swim around. And I'm wondering, are there any tools or frameworks that we might use to help navigate business life once we realize we're working within living systems?
So I think there's a couple of things that come to mind. One is the Cynefin model. It's spelled Cynefin. And what this does, it's an interesting tool to help you discern what kind of challenge or business opportunity you're dealing with. In a nutshell, it's simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic. What this model helps you understand is, is what you're working on predictable? Do you know all the parts? Do you understand what the A to B is and how to get there? And if so, the machine model might be very appropriate. If you've got something more in the complex and chaotic areas, that's when this living system model can be very helpful because the starting point is not to lock down on a prescribed route. It's really to start with observing the system, trying to see what all the different patterns are that are emerging, what's working, what do we want more of, what do we need to attend to that we don't, and really engage people in that inquiry and questioning rather than directing and telling. And both can be valuable, and it just depends on what your challenge is. So that's where I think that other tool, the appreciative inquiry approach, comes in. And book you can go look at is Appreciative Inquiry for Change Management, using appreciative inquiry to facilitate organizational development. And that lays out an approach in which you are trying to understand how people are making sense of their environment, of this chaos, of this challenge, of all the complexity. And then from there, what can emerge is priorities. Here's where we're going to begin. Here's what we're going to experiment with. Here's what we're going to be looking to learn, and then iterate from there. Because in complexity, there's just way too many variables. There's too many independent parts that we don't quite understand yet.
Well, thank you very much for teaching us about these concepts. This was really enlightening, and it was a pleasure to have you on the show. Can you tell our listeners how they can get in touch with you?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Kati Livingston. I'd be happy to connect and hear from you all. And Travis, I just want to say thanks again for having me on.
Thank you. Wow, that was a lot. If you're like me, you might be thinking, well, that escalated quickly. We started off innocent and naive, hoping to understand what organizations are. The textbook definition seemed simple enough. An organization is a network of individuals forming a coordinated system of specialized activities. But rewind the clock a few billion years, and we find that organizations are deeply connected with one of the most remarkable and mysterious features of the universe, emergence. Connected with the mystery of life itself, a stamp of the divine, if you will. And when we see organizations in this way, in a way that is similar to a colony of ants, or the cells of the human body all working together to produce the human phenomenon, we expand our understanding of what an organization is. Organizations may be better thought of as living systems. And then we barely cracked open the door of this idea, and we're drowned in a deluge of new information and ways of looking at organizations. But don't worry, we're going to be diving into all these different topics in future episodes. Before we wrap up, I want to offer two different perspectives or dimensions on this topic. An analogy to help provide some structure to the organizations as machines versus living systems idea, and implications for where we should go next in our study of organizations and management. Before entering the management and business world, I got degrees in electrical engineering, mathematics, and music. And if I were asked, what is the one thing that is common between all three topics, I would say categorically, it's the philosophical concept of abstraction, or filtering out complex details to see higher order phenomena, which I think is closely related to the idea of emergence. Does this sound like the start of another philosophical tangent? Well, if you insist, I'll give you a 2-for-1 special just this once, and only because it's a special occasion, the very first episode of the Management Theory Toolbox. Plus, as you probably already realized, I like philosophical tangents. So here we go. Let's take Ohm's law, for example. If you aren't familiar with Ohm's law, it's just the relationship between voltage, current, and resistance. V equals I times R. Electrical engineering would not be possible if we didn't have ways of simplifying the complexities of the physical world. Under the surface, we have wave propagation, quantum electrodynamics, and particle physics. Designing something as simple as a voltage divider would be difficult, and certainly not economical if we had to take into account everything, if we didn't have some way of simplifying the problem. And if we didn't have any ways of simplifying the problem, this would not just be difficult, it would literally be impossible. Because we have not yet learned everything there is to know about how the physical world works. The rabbit hole of science may be infinitely deep for all we know, but we have discovered that under certain conditions, say if a circuit is small enough compared to the relevant signal frequencies, and if there's no energy storage components in the circuit, then we can use what's called the lumped circuit model, and the measurements and equations result in a simple, predictable equation, Ohm's law. But here's the catch. As soon as we have a circuit that breaks those constraints, we find that our measurements do not match the predictions of Ohm's law. We need to start taking into account the complex underlying phenomena. Otherwise, we're going to be left guessing and using the wrong tools for the job. This is just like the organizations as machines versus living systems. Under certain conditions, if the problem to be solved is linear and predictable, and if the desired result is well-defined, we can think of our organization as a machine. And this can be a powerful tool for controlling our business processes to achieve an optimal outcome. But as Katie mentioned, even such predictable systems can break the constraints of the machine's model. Workers might get bored, changes in the social or political climate may affect both workers and the business environment, causing cracks to appear in the so-called organizational machine. And that's where we must abandon the simplicity of the machine model and realize that we're working with a living system. It's useful to zoom in and out of different levels of abstraction, to look at an organization as a machine in one moment, when the conditions are right, when the problem to be solved fits the constraints of the predictable linear causality, and the next moment to realize the complexities of the living system as soon as there are signs there might be more going on under the surface. and there are always complex human interactions going on under the surface. We understand that the study of organizations is like an intricate tapestry. Pulling on one thread can cause the whole pattern to shift. And that leads us to where we're going next in the management theory toolbox. See, once we open the door to the living systems model of organizations, we find a whole host of interactions rooted in human behavior. The study of human behavior in organizations is called organizational behavior. If we only had the scientific model of management at our disposal, we might think that squishy, fuzzy topics like employee emotion, personality, motivation, and communication are not that important, but that all changes under the living systems model. These become not just auxiliary topics, but central ones that touch every aspect of our business in ways that we've only barely scratched the surface. It's going to be a long journey, and there are so many topics to cover. But this idea of living systems provides the foundation, the bedrock, even the justification for the relevance of organizational behavior. As Kati said, organizations are a human phenomenon. And we're going to revisit this concept time and time again. So bookmark this episode and perhaps listen to it more than once, because we're going to be coming back and grounding ourselves in this idea. So that's it for our first episode of the Management Theory Toolbox. Stay tuned for part 2, where we talk more about emergence to get a better grasp on the topic, as well as explore some practical examples of the living systems idea. As always, each episode is based on the latest and most robust management theory. Check out the show notes, which contain citations, references, and links to the source material for every management theory concept in the episode. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep building your management theory toolbox.